Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Arkansas history. Please leave a comment about where you're watching from and when you heard this story before we start. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. The Ozark Mountains of Arkansas were unusually quiet in the fall of 1891. In Newton County, where thick forests went on forever between small towns, the loss of 3 experienced trappers would question everything we think we know about survival, loyalty, and the fine line between civilization and the wild. Cornelius Hadrian, Bartholomew Quince, and Lazarus Pendleton were not normal guys. They were experienced hunters, and their combined knowledge of the Arkansas wilderness went back more than 40 years. When investigators found their abandoned camp with only their rifles left, arranged in a perfect triangle around a cold fire pit, they were faced with a mystery that made no sense. Reason. In 1891, Newton County was the farthest point that Americans thought was civilized. The county was officially formed in 1842 from parts of Pope County to make room for the growing number of settlers, hunters, and opportunists who were drawn to the area by reports of plentiful wildlife and untapped natural resources. But even though the county had been officially around for almost 50 years, a lot of it was still unmapped wilderness where federal surveys had only found the most basic geographic references. Jasper's county seat was the main place for business, but its population rarely went over 800 people during the busiest times. Most people in the county lived on small farms that were connected by rough trails that were hard to get to in the winter, or when it rained for a long time. Traveling merchants, mail carriers, and the seasonal migration of trappers and hunters who kept up informal networks were very important for communication between settlements, of sharing information in the wild. The economy of Newton County was mostly based on taking advantage of natural resources, especially timber and wildlife that could be sold at stable prices in markets that could be reached through the Buffalo River and its connections to the White River system. But the most profitable things to do required a lot of knowledge about wilderness areas that were still dangerous and not well understood by new settlers. This made it possible for people who were ready to take big risks in exchange for access to resources that more cautious residents stayed away from. The 3 men who went missing would haunt Newton County for generations. They were all different parts of the frontier experience that defined Arkansas territory in the last decades of the 1800s. Each person had a different background, a set of skills, and reasons for going on the trip that would be both helpful and deadly when they all went together into the unknown depths of the Ozark. Wild. Cornelius Hadrian came to Arkansas in 1879. He brought with him the complicated legacy of a man whose early years were shaped by war, moving around, and having to adapt to quickly changing situations. He was born on March 15, 1849, in Weakley County, Tennessee. He had seen the American South change from a place where people were enslaved to work on farms to a place that was trying to rebuild itself after losing a war and going through social upheaval. Hadrian's childhood had been. The Civil War messed up his life when he was only 12 years old. His father, Marcus Hadrian, owned a small farm that grew tobacco and corn for local markets. He also owned a few slaves who helped with the family's farming. The early stages of the war didn't have much of an effect on the Hadrian farm, but by 1863 the Union Army's planned attack on Confederate infrastructure had reached western Tennessee, causing violence and economic problems, rural areas that used to be peaceful. In 1864, young Cornelius was recruited into the Confederate Army as a civilian scout. His deep knowledge of the area made him useful for gathering information and communicating between Confederate units that were spread out across the Tennessee River Valley. His job was to travel alone through areas controlled by enemy forces, deliver messages between commanders, and gather information about the movements and supply operations of the Union Army. He learned the skills from these experiences that would be very useful to him later in life when he lived in the Arkansas wilderness. He learned how to move quietly through thick woods, how to read subtle signs in the environment that showed recent human activity, and how to stay alive for long periods of time with few supplies while avoiding detection by possible enemies. More importantly, his time in the military had taught him a lot about the mental side of survival, like how to stay calm and think clearly when things are very dangerous and uncertain. When the war ended in 1865, the Hadrian family, like most people who supported the Confederacy, had to deal with a broken economy and an uncertain future in a society where traditional social and economic ties had been permanently broken. Military operations had done a lot of damage to the family farm. They had freed their slaves without paying them, and the economy in the area had collapsed because the transportation infrastructure had been destroyed and there was no currency that you can trust. Young Hadrian had spent the years right after the war trying to get the family farm back to work, but the damage to the land, the economy, and the social order had made normal farming impossible. By 1875, it was clear that people in post-war Tennessee who didn't have money or political ties to the new Reconstruction government didn't have many chances to get rich. His choice to move west to the Arkansas Territory was based on both practical need and a wish to get away from the bad memories he had of his home country. Arkansas was a good place for people who were willing to work alone in tough situations, especially in areas where the federal government had less power and personal skills were more important than political beliefs or family history. Hadrian's move to Newton County was carefully planned based on a lot of research into the area's conditions and chances. He had written letters to officials in the territory, looked at maps, and talked to other migrants who had successfully settled in Arkansas's wild areas. He chose Newton County because he thought it was the best place for someone with his unique set of skills and experience. His homestead claim included 40 acres of rough land about 8 miles northeast of Jasper. Official surveys said the land was good for farming, but settlers who had been there before acknowledged as marginal land that would necessitate extraordinary effort to cultivate productively. But Hadrian wasn't interested in traditional farming. Instead, he wanted to set up a base of operations for exploring and taking advantage of the many animals that lived in the area. The cabin he built showed how methodical he was about surviving in the wild and how important it was to make defensible positions in dangerous areas. His wartime experiences taught him how to build structures with multiple exit routes, hidden storage areas for weapons and supplies, and strategic positioning that gave him clear views of possible approach routes while still being hidden from casual observation. Hadrian hunted and trapped in a way that was very different from how most people in the area did it. Using what he learned about gathering information during the war, he made systematic ways to keep track of animal populations, seasonal migration patterns, and environmental factors that affected how animals acted. He kept personal journals with military precision that had detailed maps, weather observations, and analytical assessments that helped him figure out the best times and places to go hunting. But his careful exploration of the wild areas of Newton County had also uncovered signs of past human activity that showed the area had a more complicated history then. Official surveys of the land showed. His journals recorded findings of altered vegetation patterns, stone formations that seemed too regular to be natural, and cleared areas that showed signs of systematic cultivation even though they were far from any known homestead or settlement. These strange things had slowly piqued Hadrian's scientific interest, and he began to keep careful records of archaeological discoveries in addition to practical hunting information. Evidence that could shed light on the region's history before people lived there. His experience in gathering intelligence taught him how to spot the importance of small details and how to put together thorough analyses based on careful observation of facts. By 1883, Hadrian had gathered enough evidence to say that large parts of Newton County had been settled and changed by native people whose activities happened before the Cherokee settlements that are known to have been in the area. His results suggested that. There were organized communities that had strong trade ties and a lot of knowledge about the local environment. More interestingly, his findings showed that some places had been hidden or protected on purpose, which suggested that they were still important to indigenous people who might still have ties to their ancestors' homes. These discoveries had sparked scientific interest and heightened awareness of possible economic opportunities that went beyond the usual hunting and trapping. Archaeological sites with signs of people living there before Columbus might have artifacts that collectors and institutions interested in American Indian history would find very valuable. However, using these kinds of sites would mean thinking carefully about the legal issues and possible problems with indigenous groups who might still have traditional claims to their ancestral lands. Hadrian's interest in growing. Archaeological exploration had prompted him to pursue collaborators with complementary skills to facilitate systematic investigation of promising sites while ensuring security against potential interference from competitors or authorities. He needed people with business experience who could find markets for archaeological finds, as well as guides who were very skilled in the wilderness and had a lot of cultural knowledge that could help him interact with local indigenous people. A partnership that would end in death began to form in late 1883 when Hadrian met Bartholomew Quint during a routine visit to Milliken's General Store in Jasper. Quint's reputation as a good negotiator and his large network of business contacts caught Hadrian's eye right away as possible ways to grow his business beyond just hunting and trapping. Bartholomew Quint embodied a unique tradition of frontier entrepreneurship that stressed socializing, business networking, and finding opportunities that needed more advanced organizational skills than just surviving in the wild. He was born on November 8, 1855, in Harlan County, Kentucky. He grew up in a family whose wealth depended on being able to navigate the complicated social and economic relationships that were common in Appalachian communities in the years after the Civil War. The Quint family ran a trading post that was very important, a business center that linked remote mountain towns to markets in Lexington, Louisville, and other cities in Kentucky. The business had to keep in touch with a wide range of suppliers and customers, such as small farmers, craftsmen, traveling merchants, and even representatives from bigger businesses that wanted to get to mountain resources. Bartholomew learned from a young age how important it is to understand other people's cultures and change how he talked to them. Styles to fit the needs of different social groups. His father, Jeremiah Quint, built the family business by carefully building trust with mountain people who had valuable goods but couldn't easily get to outside markets. The elder Quint's success depended on his ability to offer fair prices for mountain goods and negotiate good terms with city merchants who bought those goods to sell in faraway markets. This needed a deep understanding of the state of the market, transportation, logistics, and the complicated cultural factors that affected economic relationships in Kentucky after the war. Bartholomew had shown an extraordinary talent for the social side of business, becoming very good at telling stories, negotiating, and keeping personal relationships that went beyond business interests. His natural charm and real interest in people made him well-liked all over Harlan County, where people appreciated how he could turn everyday business transactions into fun social events that brought people together and made the community stronger. But the family's business success also made them more vulnerable to the violent political conflicts that plagued eastern Kentucky in the 1870s, when rival groups fought for control of local government mineral rights and access to new opportunities in coal and timber extraction. The Quint trading post is in the middle of the local. Because of business, the family would have to get involved in fights between rival groups trying to control or shape the growth of the economy in the area. Bartholomew's later accounts were purposefully vague about the exact reasons he had to leave Kentucky, but evidence suggests that the family had gotten involved in fights over competing claims to valuable mineral rights in areas where traditional property ownership patterns were poorly documented. His quick exit in the early 1878 was a time when violence between rival groups was on the rise, which suggests that his staying in Harlan County was no longer safe for him. He had carefully planned his arrival in Newton County, Arkansas, so that he wouldn't draw attention from people who might be looking for him. This way, he could get back on his feet in a place where his business skills could make him money without getting involved in the political conflicts that had made life in Kentucky impossible. The choice of Arkansas was based on both practical reasons, like how far away it was from possible enemies, and positive views of the economic opportunities available to people with the right skills and backgrounds. Quint's integration into Newton County's social and economic networks had proceeded with remarkable speed, as his storytelling abilities and genuine friendliness quickly established him as a popular figure within the small community of permanent residents. Because of his business background, he was able to find market opportunities that other residents missed, especially in areas that had to do with connecting local producers with buyers far away who were willing to pay more for high-quality goods. Quint quickly became the most successful fur trader in the area after he arrived. He used his negotiation skills and business contacts to get prices that were much higher than what local trappers had been getting for their catches. His success drew the attention of experienced hunters who knew that working with someone who had better marketing skills and connections with buyers in Little Rock, Memphis, and other regional business hubs would be good for business. Quint's business dealings, on the other hand, had also shown that he was interested in opportunities that went beyond normal fur trading and into areas that might be seen as morally or legally wrong. His questions about where to sell Indian artifacts, historical curiosities, and the fact that they were willing to pursue profits through activities that were outside of normal business channels suggested that they were interested in unusual items that might interest private collectors. At first, his growing friendship with Cornelius Hadrian was based on their mutual recognition of each other's skills and their shared interest in finding new ways to make money. Hadrian's systematic documentation of archaeological sites offered potential access to materials that Quint's commercial networks could exploit for marketing purposes. Collectors who are willing to pay a lot of money for real American Indian artifacts, but they also had to think carefully about the legal and practical risks of working together on activities that might break federal rules or go against indigenous claims to ancestral sites. The third person in their partnership had cultural knowledge and wilderness skills that would be very helpful for dealing with the many problems that come up when doing archaeological research in areas where Native people still had ties to their ancestral homes. Lazarus Pendleton was a unique mix of cultural backgrounds that gave him special skills and made his relationships in Newton County's mostly white community more complicated. Pendleton was born on February 14, 1862, to a white father and a Cherokee mother. He spent his early childhood in a remote settlement that kept its traditional ways. Cherokee customs persist despite escalating federal coercion for integration into white society. His mother, who was known as Blue Dove Woman in the Cherokee community, came from a family that had hereditary duties to keep traditional knowledge about ceremonial practices, plant medicine, and the complicated spiritual connections that guided Cherokee interactions with the natural world. Lazarus had gone to school in the traditional Cherokee way, which focused on practical skills for living in the wild, cultural values, and spiritual practices that linked personal identity to larger patterns of natural and ancestral relationships. Values and spiritual practices that linked a person's sense of self to bigger patterns of natural and ancestral relationships. His grandmother, Standing Bear Woman, was especially important in passing down traditional knowledge that included advanced skills for identifying plants and animals, predicting the weather, and finding your way through difficult wilderness areas. The Cherokee school system that helped Pendleton grow up was very different from white educational approaches in its emphasis on experiential learning, spiritual integration, and community responsibility. Traditional Cherokee education didn't focus on abstract academic subjects. Instead, it taught practical skills that helped people survive in their communities and keep good relationships with the natural and spiritual forces that affected human welfare. This schooling had given Pendleton wilderness skills that were much better than those of most white people. Residents possessed an almost supernatural ability to traverse dense forest regions devoid of conventional landmarks, to anticipate meteorological shifts based on nuanced environmental cues, and to identify water sources and secure shelter in terrain that seemed inhospitable to the inexperienced. But his traditional education also taught him cultural values and spiritual beliefs that sometimes clashed with the way white people used land and resources. His grandmother died. Pendleton, who was 14 at the time, had to deal with the death of his grandmother in 1876. This caused a crisis that made it hard for him to move from living in a traditional Cherokee community to living in a mostly white community in Newton County. The federal government's policies of assimilation had destroyed most of the traditional Cherokee communities. Cherokee families that survived were under more and more pressure to adopt white cultural practices and give up their traditional identities, which were seen as barriers to successful integration in American society. Pendleton's mixed heritage made it harder for him to fit in socially because he wasn't fully part of either the Cherokee or white communities. He also had cultural knowledge and skills that both groups might have been suspicious of or not understood. His great wilderness skills got the attention of white employers who liked how well he could track and how much he knew about the environment. But his traditional spiritual beliefs and cultural ties made things more difficult. Conflicts with what white people think is appropriate behavior in social relationships. Pendleton had become the best wilderness guide in Newton County, making money by helping hunters, trappers, and even government surveyors who needed expert navigation through areas that weren't on any maps. His reputation for being dependable and very skilled had gotten over any initial biases against him because of his mixed background and his quiet demeanor. And careful avoidance of controversial subjects had reduced possible disagreements with white residents who might have negative feelings toward Indians. His cultural background also taught him about the traditional Cherokee claims to ancestral lands in Newton County, such as burial sites and ceremonial sites that still held spiritual significance even after decades of white settlement and federal territorial organization. This information made people aware of possible conflicts between white economic activities and Cherokee traditional values that people who don't have cultural ties to indigenous communities might not see. Pendleton's eventual partnership with Harrion and Quint was based on both practical reasons like the chance to make money and complicated personal reasons like the potential consequences of taking part in activities that might go against Cherokee rules about disturbing ancestral sites. He chose to join their archaeological. Exploration efforts meant taking risks that went beyond possible legal consequences to include possible spiritual and cultural punishments for breaking into sacred places. During the winter of 1883 to 1884, they talked a lot about their goals, methods, and how to split up both possible profits and likely risks before they became partners. Linked to a systematic study of archaeological sites that Hadrian had found during his surveys of the wilderness. Each partner had unique skills and knowledge that were necessary for the successful execution of their grand plans. However, their different backgrounds and reasons for doing things could also lead to conflicts that would need to be handled carefully. Hadrian's scientific method stressed the importance of carefully preserving and systematically documenting archaeological evidence that might have historical value beyond its immediate commercial value. His military background had taught him to value detail, planning, security measures, and backup plans that would lower risks and raise the chances of reaching their goals. But his methodical personality sometimes clashed with his partner's desire for more flexible methods that could quickly adapt to new situations. Quince's business point of view was to find and get into markets that would give archaeological finds the best financial returns, while also making sure that they were safe. Keep competitors or authorities from finding out about their activities, which could cause problems for them. His large network of contacts gave him access to collectors and institutions that were willing to buy real indigenous artifacts. But his business ties also made him more likely to be looked at by the law, which could put the secrecy that is necessary for successful archaeological exploitation at risk. Pendleton's knowledge of Cherokee culture helped him understand archaeological evidence in the context of traditional Cherokee beliefs that might show spiritual or ceremonial meaning that white people can't see. His wilderness skills were very useful for getting to remote places and keeping them safe from being found. His knowledge of indigenous cultural practices might help settle disagreements that could come up if Cherokee people who were responsible for protecting ancestral sites noticed their activities. Their first joint trip together during. In the spring of 1884, they tested how well they worked together by exploring one of the less important archaeological sites that Hadrian had found during his earlier surveys. The site, located in a remote valley about 15 miles southeast of Jasper, showed signs of seasonal use by native people, but it didn't have the elaborate burial features that made other sites more valuable. The main goals of the expedition were to create systematic methods for archaeology, excavation, testing equipment, and supply needs for long-term operations in the wilderness, as well as checking how well security measures work to keep potential observers from noticing. However, the experience also gave each partner a chance to see how reliable and skilled his coworkers were and to find possible sources of conflict that could threaten future collaborations. The results of their first expedition were better than they had hoped for in both, in terms of archaeological finds and how well they worked together. Their methodical approach had turned up a number of artifacts that were clearly valuable for trade, such as pottery shards, stone tools, and decorative items that showed advanced craftsmanship and artistic taste. More importantly, their work together had shown that their different backgrounds and points of view could be used to make results that were better than what any one person could have done on their own. But the trip had also shown possible problems that would need to be carefully thought about before starting bigger projects. Evidence at the site indicated that their activities had been monitored by unidentified individuals with remarkable woodland expertise and a clear understanding of archaeological excavation methods. Subtle disruptions to their equipment and the methodical inspection of their workspaces suggested monitoring by individuals who comprehended the importance of archaeological investigation and may be either competitors or protectors with interests that were at odds with their business goals. Pendleton's interpretation of some environmental signs that suggested their actions had caused reactions from Cherokee residents who still had ties to the archaeological site was the most worrying. His knowledge of Cherokee culture helped him see signs that white people might not see, but that were clear warnings in Cherokee traditional communication systems. These signs pointed to the fact that their ongoing archaeological work would draw more and more direct attention from Cherokee protectors, whose responses could go from just watching to more forceful actions meant to stop the desecration of ancestral sites. Even though they were worried about these things, the fact that their first expedition was a commercial success gave them a strong reason to expand their operations to include bigger archaeological sites that promised bigger financial returns. Quince's early talks with possible buyers showed that there was a strong demand for real Cherokee artifacts, especially ones that were very artistic or had clear ceremonial meaning. People in Little Rock, Memphis, and even faraway cities like St. Louis were willing to pay a lot of money for items that could be proven to have come from certain archaeological sites. the planning for their larger operations in 1884 and 1885. They had to think carefully about legal, practical, and cultural factors that could affect their success or make them more vulnerable to different kinds of interference. Federal rules about archaeological work on public lands were still not well defined and were not always followed. This was especially true in remote areas where the government was not very present, and it was hard to find out about violations. But the increasing political power of people who fight for indigenous rights made it seem like federal policies might become more. In the future, laws may become stricter, so people who have the right access and skills should take advantage of archaeological resources right away. Their choice of targets for systematic exploitation was based on Hurrian's in-depth study of promising sites and Pendleton's understanding of how traditional Cherokee people feel about certain places. Some sites seemed to be mostly important for historical reasons, which might not bother Cherokee protectors too much. Others, on the other hand, clearly still had spiritual significance that would make indigenous communities that wanted to protect sacred sites very defensive. The best place for them to expand their business was a complex archaeological site about 25 miles southeast of Jasper, in a remote valley that was hard to get to safely without special navigation skills. Hurrian's initial surveys had uncovered substantial evidence of prolonged habitation, featuring intricate earthworks and seemingly ceremonial structures and signs of burial sites that could have a lot of artifacts. However, the site's features also suggested that it was very important to Cherokee traditional culture. This is shown by Pendleton's unwillingness to talk about its specific features and his insistence on taking extra steps to keep areas that were still spiritually important from being disturbed. His understanding of culture told him that the place was a major ancestral burial ground that was still protected by traditional Cherokee guardians who had both the power and the duty to protect the sacred sites from people who weren't allowed to be there. The difficult talks that had to happen to get Pendleton to agree to work on this very sensitive site showed the main problems in their partnership between business goals and cultural obligations. His eventual agreement to move forward showed that he thought that limited respectful excavation might be okay if performed in accordance with established protocols that recognized Cherokee spiritual authority while preventing systematic desecration of the most sacred sites. These talks also shed light on the bigger cultural conflicts that marked the relationships between Native and white communities on the frontier in the last decades of the 1800s. Federal policies officially recognized white authority over territorial lands and resources, but practical enforcement of these policies remained limited in. In remote areas, indigenous people kept traditional systems of government and protection that worked without the federal government's approval or recognition. The summer and fall expeditions of 1884 to 1887 made their partnership one of the most successful archaeological exploitation operations in Arkansas Territory. They made a lot of money without being caught by federal authorities or having to deal with interference from other groups. Their methodical approach combines scientific documentation with business efficiency, making detailed records of archaeological finds and getting the most out of promising sites. But their success also drew more attention from Cherokee residents, who kept an eye on what they were doing and thought about how continued archaeological work would affect the protection of ancestral sites. With each expedition, the proof of surveillance got better and more consistent, which suggests that Cherokee protectors were creating systematic countermeasures to record violations and get ready to protect sacred sites. By 1888, the tensions between their business success and rising Cherokee opposition had made it necessary to think carefully about long-term viability and risk management. Pendleton's connections to Cherokee culture gave him access to information about how they felt and what they wanted, which helped him warn people about possible conflicts ahead of time. But his mixed. Loyalty also caused problems with partnerships inside the company, which made it harder to make decisions about future operations. During a reconnaissance trip in late summer 1890, they found their most important archaeological site. They systematically explored a valley that had never been explored before, and found what looked like a major ceremonial and burial complex that had been used by indigenous people for hundreds of years. The site's features pointed to an extraordinary historical and cultural importance that promised similarly high commercial value for those who could access and use its resources in a systematic way. Hadrian's thorough records showed advanced burial customs, a lot of grave goods that showed trade links over hundreds of miles, and artistic accomplishments that showed cultural sophistication that went against common ideas about what indigenous people could do. The archaeological evidence pointed to the presence of several indigenous groups. Over long periods of time, with the most recent burials dating back to the time just before white people settled in Arkansas. But the site's clear importance also made people aware that exploitation would be a major threat to Cherokee traditional authority and could lead to defensive actions that went beyond previous warnings and surveillance. Pendleton's cultural knowledge confirmed that the location was very important to Cherokee spirituality and remained actively protected by traditional guardians whose duties included keeping unauthorized people from desecrating it. During 1890 and early 1891, they spent most of their time and energy on planning how to safely and systematically exploit this very valuable but dangerous site. They made plans for complicated supply and transportation systems, bought specialized excavation equipment, and came up with advanced security measures, making detailed backup plans for different emergency situations that could mean having to leave the site right away. But their planning got harder when more and more evidence showed that Cherokee protectors had set up a systematic opposition to their activities and were getting ready to defend themselves, which could have included directly confronting archaeological expeditions that crossed sacred lines. Pendleton's cultural ties gave him access to information about what the Cherokee wanted to do, and skills that made it possible to get an early warning of possible conflicts. But his reports also showed that if the violations continued, the responses would get worse and worse, which could put the safety of the partnership members at risk. The final decision to go ahead with their most ambitious expedition was based on their belief that the possible financial rewards were worth the extra risks that came with challenging Cherokee traditional authority to protect ancestral burial sites. But their choice also signified an acknowledgement that the successful attainment of their goals necessitated the systematic transgression of cultural boundaries upheld for generations, potentially resulting in repercussions that transcended traditional legal or commercial sanctions. For their fall 1891 expedition, they paid more attention than ever to security and logistics, because they knew that success would depend on quick, efficient excavation, followed by immediate evacuation before the Cherokee. Protectors could plan a successful intervention. They needed special tools for careful digging, materials to protect fragile artifacts, transportation equipment for valuable finds, and weapons to protect themselves in case of an emergency. Most importantly, they made plans for communication and evacuation procedures to make sure that everyone would be safe if they had to leave the archaeological site right away, in bad weather. These preparations showed that they knew that using the most sacred Cherokee burial ground would be a direct threat to Native authority that could lead to even worse defensive actions than they had ever seen before. The morning of October 12, 1891, was the start of their last expedition. Many people later said that the weather was bad, unlike their last departures, which were marked by quinces. The three partners were getting ready for their last adventure with little talking and a lot of tension that suggested they were aware of the extra risks that came with their plans. The first part of their journey to the remote archaeological site required them to follow established trails. After that, they would use paths that only Pendleton knew about and that were only shown on Hadrian's private maps. They intentionally took different routes to avoid being seen by other trappers, travelers, or possible informants who might tell the authorities or competitors about their movements. This was because they were worried that someone might report their archaeological finds to the authorities or competitors. For the first 3 days of travel, everything went according to plan. With normal progress through familiar territory that made it easy to move their specialized equipment and supplies toward the wilderness base camp they had chosen as their final destination. Preparations. But signs of surveillance were clear as early as the second day of their trip, with small signs that their movements were being watched by people who were very good at woodworking and seemed to know a lot about where they were going. The fact that they found markers that had been put there on purpose along their route proved that Cherokee scouts were following their expedition and telling other groups who were planning defensive actions about their progress. Keep the holy burial site safe. These markers used traditional Cherokee ways of communicating that most white people wouldn't be able to see, but they were clear messages to Native Americans about how to respond to territorial violations. Pendleton's analysis of these warning signs indicated that Cherokee Guardians were employing organized defensive strategies aimed at recording infractions while facilitating voluntary exit prior to the necessity of more forceful intervention. Needed. His cultural knowledge helped him understand that the markers were the first steps in traditional protective procedures that would get worse in predictable ways until the violations stopped or serious consequences were given. But when he talked about how the Cherokee communicated, he also showed the basic conflict between his cultural loyalties and his partnership duties that had caused problems in their working relationship. His taking part in. Archaeological exploitation activities violated the traditional Cherokee values he had internalized during his formative years. His financial reliance on partnership income provided pragmatic motivations to persist in endeavors that his cultural upbringing indicated were spiritually and morally improper. The setting up of their base camp on October 15th was the last chance for them to think again about their planned excavation activities because more and more evidence was coming in that Cherokee. Opposition had moved from just watching to actively getting ready to intervene in defense. The careful placement of observers around the camp's perimeter showed that their activities were always being watched. At the same time, the systematic inspection of their equipment during short absences showed that Cherokee scouts knew a lot about their archaeological goals and how to dig them up. The most concerning thing was proof that Cherokee protectors had started putting in place steps meant to cut off any help that the archaeological expedition might have gotten, and to make it impossible for people to leave on their own, which could have avoided a direct confrontation. When they found out that their pack animals had been driven away during the night, they immediately knew that their situation had gotten worse than they could handle with normal defensive measures. Without dependable transportation for their gear and supplies, it was impossible for people to stay for long periods of time at their remote base camp. Leaving right away would mean leaving behind important archaeological finds that took years of careful planning and a lot of money to find. As a response to this crisis, they tried to talk directly to Cherokee protectors using traditional methods that Pendleton was familiar with from his own culture. But it looks like these talks didn't lead to terms that were acceptable for settling their violations because Cherokee traditional authority couldn't acknowledge white assertions to ancestral burial sites, or permit ongoing desecration for commercial objectives. The fundamental incompatibility between Cherokee spiritual values and white commercial objectives rendered compromise unattainable, leaving only alternatives that necessitated either voluntary acceptance of Cherokee judgment or ongoing violations that would provoke progressively severe defensive reactions. The last week of their trip was spent getting ready to leave in a way that would be decided by Cherokee protectors instead of what they wanted or what was easiest for them. Hadrian's journal fragments talk about how they knew their fate would be decided by Cherokee justice practices that put the protection of ancestral burial sites above individual rights or federal legal authorities. The careful placement of their rifles around the fire pit showed that they respected Cherokee authority and would accept whatever judgment traditional protectors made, suitable for breaches of sacred limits. This symbolic surrender showed that they understood that the only way to solve their problems was to give up white legal systems in favor of indigenous traditional practices that were based on principles that were older and more legitimate in their own right than federal territorial authority. The subsequent disappearance of Cornelius Hadrian, Bartholomew Quince, and Lazarus Pendleton facilitated the resolution of conflicts between white commercial interests and Cherokee traditions. Responsibilities for keeping burial sites safe for ancestors. Their fate was a strong warning to others who might break the law, and it showed that traditional defensive systems still worked well even without federal recognition or permission. The finding of their abandoned camp on December 14th proved that they had settled their problems through negotiation instead of violence, with systematic planning for leaving showing cooperation, with the help of Cherokee officials instead of kidnapping or killing them. The way they organized their supplies and personal items showed that they accepted the traditional judgment that said they had to leave areas where their presence threatened sacred sites. But the exact details of their fate were still protected by Cherokee rules that said it was wrong to talk about sacred things with people who weren't allowed to. This made it so that people couldn't talk about it, which was more effective than legal punishments. Information that could lead to more violations. This systematic protection of sensitive information was in line with traditional practices that put the long-term safety of ancestral sites ahead of working with outside authorities whose authority was not recognized or respected when it came to sacred places. The official investigation by Newton County authorities faced persistent challenges due to the Cherokees' reluctance to address issues they deemed sacred and safeguarded by traditional rules against sharing information without permission. Marshal Bramshaw's reports show that he was frustrated because Cherokee residents who clearly knew where the missing trappers were but wouldn't give him information that could have put traditional protective systems at risk. The case was still officially unsolved, but according to traditional Cherokee justice practices, the way it was solved provided good protection for the burial site that had drawn the trappers there in the first place. Pay attention. After that, informal methods were used to protect the site that worked better and lasted longer than federal rules. This made sure that the remains of the ancestors stayed undisturbed by people who might try to sell them for a profit. The story of the missing trappers became part of local folklore that served both educational and protective functions within Newton County's complex multicultural community. For Cherokee people, the story showed that traditional ways still work. Protective practices, and for white settlers, it gave them warnings about what could happen if they crossed cultural lines they didn't fully understand. The 3 rifles, standing in perfect formation around the cold ashes of their last fire, are still the strongest symbol of this meeting of cultures and the end of fights over who has the right to control the land. They stand for the lasting memory of missing men, signs of surrender or warnings to future violators. The strength of traditional protective measures that were based on rules that were older and more accepted in the area than federal law. This case serves as a reminder that the American frontier had many different kinds of authority, tradition, and justice that still worked according to rules that came before the federal system of land ownership. In 1891, the Arkansas wilderness was not empty land waiting for white people to settle, but a complicated area where native protective systems kept things under control. Over sacred places, even though the government says it has control over them. Their disappearance ultimately safeguarded more than an archaeological site. It kept Cherokee authority alive and showed that some lines could not be crossed without facing consequences that were more in line with indigenous ideas of justice than federal ones. The silence that surrounded their fate was more effective than legal bans at keeping sacred places safe for a long time and keeping traditions alive. Territorial control systems that used spiritual rather than business standards to decide how land could be used. The abandoned camp next to the Buffalo River tributary is still an invisible monument to the strength of traditional protective forces in places that look empty to people who don't have the right cultural knowledge. Some boundaries go beyond legal documents and survey maps. They are kept by methods that are older and more reliable than federal authority, which makes sure that sacred places stay safe. Safe from people who want to take advantage of them for their own gain.